All right, welcome back. So we're going to continue our discussion on business power, okay? And we're going to tie in a couple of theories, and I brought back some of our friends, these models, and we'll show how they work together. So there's two different perspectives on business power, the dominance theory and the pluralist theory. Let's have a look at these. Okay. Dominance theory and pluralist theory. So the dominance theory basically says that business is the most powerful institution in society because it controls all the money. Okay? So because of that, business power is not really checked, and therefore it's actually pretty excessive. So if you were to tie this into the dominance model, you would see that business would be probably up top, and then kind of in the middle here you'd have the government and then the masses. That'd be dominance theory. So dominance theory is a refinement of the dominance model. Okay? Remember, theories are refinements of what we observe in reality, whereas models are things that we inherently suppose. So you might believe in the dominance theory if you have seen the media and say, wow, you know, these big companies, they control everything, confirming my initial suppositions. Okay? And you've also got the alternate, the pluralist theory, and that's the idea that power, not just among businesses, but is not just among businesses, but multiple groups of interest have degrees of power, and power is therefore kind of counterbalanced, checks and balances. Okay, and this goes actually quite well with the countervailing forces model, or countervailing forces model, or the stakeholder model. Okay, they actually go. That all actually goes pretty well together because you see that. Business is not the dominant force, but other people have kind of power too. I used to always think of this as kind of like a game of pool, where you have different balls hitting each other and bouncing around, and this therefore is my interpretation of the pluralist theory. And again, you would observe this in reality and say, well, yeah, this one business thought they could dominate. Thank goodness the government stepped in and saved society. Or, you know, this is an evil business, therefore we're going to boycott. The business comes down to its knees, changes for society's benefit, and somehow the government is happy to. So there's different, I could observe that in reality, which would confirm my initial suppositions. Let's give a little bit of refinement here. So in dominance theory, again, the context, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture, the context for the dominance theory arose out of kind of corporate asset concentration that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, where you had these mega firms that began conducting interstate commerce, where you had these mega firms that began conducting international commerce, and actually governments even had no power or had limited power over these organizations because, let's face it, through lobbying, through corruption, through all sorts of activities, suddenly government became a servant to corporations. Even organizations like the Fuggers Bank in Austria was so wealthy that it could actually deal with kings as an equal or as a superior. And we had the same thing here with the railroads, large banking, Standard Oil, etc. These were empirical observations that seemed to be well generalized through the dominance theory and confirmed people like Marx's understanding of a dominance model. So that's kind of the historical background. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in a couple videos. So the public began to view these colossal firms as monuments to greed. Okay? And again, you think about these robber barons living so well, where the common people were suffering so much. And corporations, even throughout the 20th century, have continued to grow. It seems that there's a rise in asset concentration that's leveling off. However, with the technology revolution, we're not quite sure what's going to happen there. Okay. Now, another refinement of the dominance theory is that there is kind of a powerful elite at the top of this pyramid that controls everything. And C. Wright Mills called this the power elite, this kind of small group of individuals in control of the economy, the government, and the military. It's like the Illuminati. Ooh. So those are the people at the top. They control everything. So even within this top of the pyramid, there's like an extreme top with a dozen people that call all the shots for pretty much everything. Then there's a regular business, then there's government, and then there's the masses. And that's this idea of the power elite. So at this point, we're going to conclude our discussion of power. And so then now that you understand the terms of power and legitimacy and understand that there is some degree of struggle, we're going to actually move on to our discussion of business history.